All right. Greetings, everyone. Today, we, as the Environment and Social Issues Cluster of Nickel and Dined, will be conducting our monthly roundtable on what I believe is a very relevant topic. That is how global conflicts disrupt sustainable efforts and supply chains. As we remain surrounded by conflicts, one cannot help but wonder about the severity of the repercussions caused by the very nature of these conflicts. Despite the recent announcement of a ceasefire between Iran and Israel, several key conflicts remain underway across the globe, including the Russian Ukrainian war and Israel's continued massacre of Gaza, along with, again, if I were to include the Sudanese civil war. The tensions that have erupted as a consequence of these conflicts have led to a series of precautionary measures being enacted by several nations across the globe, including strategic port closures, airspace diversion, and supply chain disruptions, which have worked to actively descale international sustainable development efforts and inversely affect sustainable supply chains. These conflicts are not just humanitarian crises and catastrophes, but they also highlight urgent environmental, economic, and developmental emergencies. Having said that, I would like to begin today's roundtable by calling on Sumedha to actually tell us a little bit about how do these conflicts actually delay sustainable efforts across the globe and how are they disrupting the supply chains.
I would like to begin by firstly on a positive note that the past decade has seen a lot of progressive change in social activism that is related to climate change, energy policies, and we see millions around the world actually participating in protest strikes and other forms of resistance. In particular, I would like to highlight global climate strike of 2019 led by Greta Thunberg, and almost billions of people and more than 150 countries have actually catalyzed important concessions and made climate pledges not only from corporations but also from government and from individuals as well. However, these supportive initiatives are the need of the hour, because as climate change and global warming has increased drastically, we can quite practically feel it with increased temperatures in summers, the blatant pollution which makes it physically difficult to breathe. These initiatives are constantly challenged by these ongoing global conflicts. We as a generation have seen quite a lot of challenging times, to put it lightly. And starting off with the pandemic, with the pandemic and the Russia invasion of Ukraine, and the Israel-Palestine conflict, if you want to call it that, and the Israel-Iran conflict. And these are only the ones which have been highlighted in the media. There include several civil wars in Yemen and Sudan and Syria, which also contribute to these issues. The first thing that comes to our minds when we actually think about wars is the loss of human lives and warfare. Therefore, what happens during these major global conflicts, that climate change initiatives are pushed to the sidelines, and these sustainable development and infrastructures are also pushed to the sidelines. More focus and emphasis is actually laid upon warfare, militarization, and humanitarian aid. As it is, most people, corporations, and governments in the world do not consider, or rather show a lack of care towards the growing climate crisis. So you can only imagine what must be happening when countries engage in conflict and wars, which we see an abundance of currently. So, firstly, this shift can be seen in various forms. For example, starting off with the phenomenon of energy insecurity. This gives rise to putting aside decarbonization schemes and resumed usage of coal and fossil fuels. One prominent example for this is the European Union's reversion to the usage of coal and coal based fossil fuels due to depleting gas resources. Because before the war between Russia and Ukraine, which started in February of 2022, which is still going on, the EU heavily relied on Russian gas. And I think it almost accounts for half of its energy supply. Due to imposition of sanctions, Russia significantly reduced its exports. Therefore, this caused a huge disruption in the supply chain. Therefore, this energy crisis led to EU nations reverting back to using coal and fossil fuels. For example, Germany had a very significant energy transition policy, which mandated shutting down of coal plants, but this had to be reconsidered given the war and depleting gas resources and the and opening up of these coal plants. So eventually, what this does is war not only directly affects the climate due to militarization, which causes irreversible harm as we know it, but indirectly also affects breakage sustainable supply chains by breaking them, and it impedes decarbonization methods. Therefore, the European Green Deal, which actually implies to their one of the primary aims is to create a green Europe and have net zero greenhouse gas emissions. All these goals are further delayed as and when these conflicts keep happening. Now, shifting from the EU, we see West Asia and North Africa, also known as the WANA regions. Now, these regions are are really rich in sunlight and wind. So this makes them the perfect hub for renewable sources of energy. But as we see, a lot of countries in these continents are fragmented by conflict, political destabilization, unstable governments, civil wars. For example, in Syria, Yemen, and in parts of Sudan, renewable energy projects have grounded to a stop because of these political instabilities and them being war zones. This creates a constant threat of violence, which causes an apprehension of threats within countries to even install or even finance any sustainable infrastructure. So, therefore, lastly, all this exhibits that it creates a pattern where governments are increasing defense budgets, and due to this increased defense budget the climate suffers, leading to perhaps one of the most dangerous consequences, which is complete sidelining of climate policy goals. Therefore, we are when a conflict is going on, most countries will like to prioritize militarization and national security naturally. What this does is, this is a phenomenon which we had studied in economics also last semester. What it does is it causes crowding out of investment. Due to huge spending of the government on the military, it can have a crowding out impact, which basically means these investments to other areas, for example even healthcare, education, and climate change, are cut off and are more and are put in favor of increasing military budgets. So this not only hinders essential things like healthcare and education, which you would probably consider come on a higher point. So this not only cuts it from that, but it obviously cuts it from sustainable infrastructure and all the funding required to it. Therefore, what we see is, due to this global conflict, there is a direct harm to people, very directly. Due to, you can clearly see the genocide going on in Gaza, the loss of human lives, there are children dying of starvation. Not only that, each bomb that is fired, that causes pollution to no amounts that we cannot even imagine. So not only that, while that is having a direct impact, all these conflicts, no matter where in the world, affect the entire world globally, because they break trade chains and supply chains. Therefore, therefore this is the overall impact, how we can consider that militarization leads to climate change goals being hindered.
Awesome. Thank you, Sumeda, for your very thorough insights. I believe what you said is actually very, very evident recently as we saw NATO expand its defense budget. And at the NATO summit, Trump was praised in a big way for what many people call unilaterally raising the NATO's defense budget. So that's there. And again, as again, aware citizens and students, we all know such incidents of this scale do not exist in isolation and do not happen in isolation. They have a ripple effect, and this reprioritization of investments will have its ripple effect on all kinds of climate efforts, health and education-based efforts. And to circle back to where you began from, to quote Greta Thunberg, you can't have environmental justice or climate justice without social justice. So again, some very impressive points. And I think what you said actually perfectly sets us up for the next question. So I would now like to invite Saksham to talk about how do the effects of these geopolitical conflicts intensify environmental degradation and exacerbate the environmental vulnerability of already pretty fragile ecosystems and zones. So the floor is yours, Saksham.
Hello, everyone. I'd like to start answering my question by putting forward a natural notion, which is that we see these conflict-prone areas as a base for just war, where climate vulnerability is just a natural consequence. But what we don't realize is that this area starts fighting a two-front war one which is fought on the battlefield and one on the climate front, which is often ignored. The intersection of geopolitical conflict and climate vulnerability represents one of the most urgent challenges, especially in developing nations in the region of the global south. Geopolitical conflicts have increasingly become compounded crises, where violence not only ravage human lives but also erode the ecological foundations of the regions which are already climate vulnerable. The environmental and humanitarian costs of conflict are interwoven and deeply entangled with each other. Additionally, violent conflict is not just a barrier to sustainable development goals, but it is also making us gallop towards environmental degradation and humanitarian collapse. So the first section or the first subsection is the environmental ramification of war. In modern day conflict, they are really confined to the conventional consequences and the land of the battle. Bombings, blockades, scorched earth tactics, and deliberate targeting of infrastructure lead to long term ecological damage, which only the local populace of those regions face subsequent to the end of the war. In war torn areas like Gaza, Donbass, and Sudan, the degradation of natural resources has been cataclysmic. Data suggests that in Gaza, the destruction of power plants, water treatment facilities, agricultural zones has led to the contamination of underground water sources, which will affect the coming generations as well. The pollution of the coastal areas, and there has been collapse of a whole food chain. CIPRI report also proves and substantiates that over 90% of water in Gaza is not fit for drinking anymore because of seawater intrusion and infrastructural collapse. This is a crisis worsened by repeated airstrikes and bombing and exacerbated by dirty tactics like siege, as is currently happening in Gaza as we talk. In eastern Ukraine's Donbas region, shelling and mining during the ongoing war have released hazardous chemicals in nature into rivers and soil, threatening local ecosystems. Clean energy projects are facing headwinds in some markets from cost inflation, supply chain bottlenecks, and higher borrowing costs. According to the International Committee of the Red Cross, environmental damage in Donbass is so extensive that it may take more than decades to remedy it. Also in Sudan, in the area of Darfur, which is often cited as one of the first modern climate wars rooted in competition over declining water and agricultural land. The civil war has made the environmental vulnerabilities worse. The second facet of this compounded crisis is about refugees and their displacement. We know that war causes an influx of asylum seeking. But war is not just about guns and bombs causing people to move away from their homes. War-induced displacement is also an environmental one. Refugee flows from conflict zones place immense strain on surrounding environments, something which has happened from the area of eastern Ukraine to Poland and other regions as well, especially when camps are established in areas which are already ecologically sensitive. These asylum seekers face multiple difficulties furthermore. Some nuances have also come out, like Italy transferring its refugees to Albania so that there's less strain on its resources. In South Sudan, for example, internally displaced people often settle in wetlands or forested areas where resource extraction rapidly accelerates deforestation. There are multiple types of resources extraction currently happening in the area of South Sudan. For example, hunting, charcoal production, and firewood. Similarly, the influx of refugees from Syria into Lebanon and Jordan has led to overuse of limited freshwater supplies and degradation of agricultural land, amplifying the pre-existing pressure of climate in those already climate vulnerable regions. CIPRI also highlights that these movements also lead to what might be called displaced environmental governance, where state institutions tasked with climate adaptation are weakened or dissolved, and they leave gaps in oversight and enforcement. In informal economies, black markets become pervasive, and land use conflicts often emerge in this vacuum. This leads us to the final facet, which is finally a vicious cycle as a result of the previous two facets. So there's conflict, there's climate, and there's collapse of all institutions. This is evident in Sudan, where the war has dismantled agencies responsible for environmental regulation, halted climate resilience programs, and redirected all national resources towards military and emergency response. Climate vulnerability becomes a weapon of war, which is being seen in the siege of Gaza, where territory has been locked into chronic humanitarian and environmental crises, pushing people to starvation. Water is cut off to control populations. Agricultural zones can be raised to create famine. Waste treatment plants can be targeted to cause long-term health hazards. This violates not only these principles of environment and humanitarianism, but also sustainable development goals, particularly Sustainable Development Goal 13 and 16, which talk about climate action, peace, justice, and strong institutions, respectively. So I'd like to conclude by saying that there is a move forward, embedding environmental safeguards into humanitarian relief and planning for the refugees and asylum seekers, protecting these assets of ecology during wartime, not merely restoring them afterward, can also be a consequence, given that countries and states these days already know that they are going to attack a particular country, and the knowledge they have is very prior, which was seen in the Israel-Iran war, which is evident in the type of intelligence used and the type of precision attacks happening. So I'd like to conclude by saying something which the government of India and its prime minister have repeatedly said, that this is definitely not the era of war, for it has consequences of an unprecedented scale, not just in terms of direct casualties, but also in terms of human lives claimed by an offshoot disaster started by the conflict, which then creates a chain.
Uh, Thank you so much for your insights, Saksham. I think you very wonderfully brought out the whole chain reaction that the war actually culminates to, starting from the very, very extensive exploitation of all its resources and the from the war front, the war economy, spending, increasing a defense budget, planning and expediting strategic strikes, and again the chokehold on resources, forced migration, displaced governance, which again very critically affects sustainable development goals, because not only like your ecological areas is lost and not only your humanitarian and environmental resources are lost, it's very different to reclaim them, and it's going to be a very troublesome procedure, because again like you can't just grow the same crops back, because the environment and the ecosystem is very, very extensively damaged to a very severe extent. So thank you for bringing all those points up. And speaking of sustainable development goals, I would like to now call upon, one second, Arpita. Uh, yeah, I would like to know, sorry, I would like to now call upon Arpita to talk about what are the implications of war economies and arms production on global carbon footprints and sustainable development goals.
Thank you so much for your question, Shaurya. I'd like to respond to this question by basically centering around two main sustainable development goals, which is firstly SDG 13, which is climate action, SDG 16, which is peace, justice, and strong institutions. Um, Basically, and how they're fundamentally undermined by the expansion of war economies and arms production. So first, let's begin by talking about the environmental cost. Carbon footprint in the military industry is complex, and somehow it is still underreported. According to data cited by Science Direct, the military sector is one of the largest institutional customers of fossil fuels globally. And the United States military alone emits more carbon dioxide annually than many medium-sized countries as well. Tanks, jets, naval fleets, armed factories, etc. All these are very carbon intensive systems, and none of them are accounted for in the national emissions targets under the Paris Agreement due to reporting exemptions. And this is considered to be one of the major loopholes in global climate accountability. Now, let's move on and speak about war economies. We are basically also not just referring to the conflict itself, but also how there is a large amount of public and private investment that basically goes towards defense and militarization of these countries. In 2023, global military expenditure reached a historic high of about $2.2 trillion, even as funding for climate adaptation and loss and damage facilities in the global south remains inadequate. We're seeing a world where arming is basically faster than adapting to these changes. Moving on to the Russia and Ukraine war, this can be basically seen as a textbook example. As the IEA's 2023 World Energy Outlook reports, the war has caused massive energy disruptions and just basically pushed European states to temporarily revive coal plants, as previously discussed, inflating global energy prices and delaying low carbon energy transitions across the global south. While the crisis has accelerated energy security agendas in some of the wealthier nations, it basically, in a way, exposes how fragile the clean energy like process really is. Adapting to these clean energy systems really is. Now, next is the Iran-Israel escalation that has recently taken place, and which has had ripple effects on the global supply chains, especially for critical minerals. This has led to rerouting delays, increased costs, all of which has incredibly slowed down the pace of decarbonization across the world. Now, moving on to the second SDG goal, SDG 16, war economies, as we all know, erode peace and justice, not just through violence, but also they undermine the very institutions that are, it's meant to uphold, like law, equity, sustainability. All these things are so important in the global order currently. In conflict zones, governments and governance basically break down. Infrastructure is destroyed, environmental protections are suspended, and displaced communities across like these regions, they basically lose access to health, water, education, and livelihoods, etc., as we have discussed before as well. There are many reports that basically point out to how climate vulnerabilities and conflicts are deeply intertwined, and they create feedback loops that disproportionately affect the global south. Um, and so I think one really important question that we need to raise in today's time is, can we generally talk about sustainability in a world where investment in arms is like the speed of investment in arms outpaces the investment of adapting to the changes that are required to move to a more sustainable world, building a more sustainable world. It's a question of basically how we as countries, developed, underdeveloped, basically sort our priorities, what our global priorities really are. The gap between climate ambition and geopolitical reality is very, very wide currently. And unless we confront this, unless we bring sustainability and environment to make it a global priority, I particularly think that none of these goals are achievable. So yeah, over to you, Shaurya.
All right, Abhida, thank you for so much for bringing out all the points that you just did. And I think, especially again, as you said, it has a very immense impact on all the SDGs, particularly, I think, also on global collaboration, because again, that's what wars do, right? They hinder those international communities and lobbies that are meant for these initiatives. And I think as we will go into the subsequent questions for this roundtable, we'll also be looking into the question of climate finance. And these kind of wars actually very much disrupt that, especially climate finance cooperations between the global south and the global north. With this, with the first half of the roundtable being completed, I would like to now hand over the rest of the roundtable to Navya. Please take it ahead.
As Arpita rightly stated, from frequently, how countries underreport emissions or overlook sustainability, and the disproportionate effect of these wars, conflicts, genocides, and everything on the global south. I'll start off with a quote. When winds of war blow, the foundations of sustainability shake. With this in mind, let's pivot this discussion or roundtable from the immediate environmental effect and humanitarian tolls of conflict or genocide, or the irresponsible decisions of our leaders, political leaders, billionaires, millionaires, to a more systematic interrogation of how do we build resilience into the very architecture of sustainability in a conflict-prone world, right? So with this, I would like to put the first question forward. Now we'll be exploring the how of what it is. So how do um what frameworks and multilateral solutions can help insulate green transitions and supply chains from geopolitical shocks? And I would like to dedicate this question to Varsha. So you can take it up.
Thank you, Navya. So, when we're addressing this question, we have to remember that most of the green transitions depend on global value chains. So, for important resources like EV batteries, solar panels, and rare minerals, this global interdependence also makes them very vulnerable to geopolitical conflicts, especially when these critical resources are monopolized or most of them go through routes that are in unstable regions. A clear example of this has already mentioned that is the Red Sea blockade, where Iran-backed Houthi rebels began attacking ships after the Israel-Gaza conflict. Even though they claim to just target Israeli-linked vehicles, we've seen that multiple unrelated ships have also been disrupted. So this is causing the shipping routes to be redirected through the Cape of Good Hope around Africa, causing significant delays and increase carbon emissions and movement of clean energy parts for things like EV batteries and solar panels from Asia to be very delayed. And another example could be the Russia-Ukraine war, which underscored the heavy dependence of Europe on Russia for natural gas. And when the sanctions were implied, the sudden cutoff made them very vulnerable and created an energy insecurity, forcing them to look for alternate options and creating an immense financial burden on the countries that had to look for multiple other options. And so when we're addressing these, I'm going to focus on three main frameworks or solutions that we can use to insulate such green transactions in supply chains. The first one could be diversifying these green supply chains. So we need to break our over dependence on one particular country. For example, India imports almost 50% of its lithium from China. But China is an unfriendly nation, and this can significantly make our manufacturers more vulnerable if it decided to turn on us. So, an example that India has used is the lithium triangle diplomacy with Argentina, Bolivia, and Chile that focuses on getting lithium from multiple other sources from friendlier nations. So it doesn't risk us losing out or like our manufacturer is being vulnerable if China turns on us. And a second solution or framework that we can use would be strengthening our regional trade alliances. And an example of this could include the India, Middle East, Europe corridor that is a safe alternative from high risk areas like that of the Red Sea currently, which is a conflict prone area. So instead of all trade stopping if the Suez Canal gets compromised, then we have alternate routes to facilitate trade to continue. And finally, another very important approach to consider is the conflict blind spot in climate finance. Very often, conflict sensitive areas are also the most vulnerable to climate change. This is because there's a cycle created by conflicts that reduce the country's ability to adapt by destroying their institutions and systems and services like water and electricity and their environmental resilience. And because of this, further climate change again worsens this since it causes food insecurity, water scarcity, and displacement and social unrest that may provoke further violence. So this problem is a serious issue, but less than 1% of the global climate finance actually goes to these conflict and climate vulnerable areas because the donor country sees these regions as too risky or unstable or politically complicated to actually provide the finance for. But leaving such countries out will actually risk putting the most vulnerable people into a cycle of coping with more crises, one after the other, and undermining any recent development they may have had to in these decades before the conflicts. An example is the Russia-Ukraine war, where Ukraine lost about 36 billion euros in terms of soil, air, water pollution, and a large portion of its natural areas are wiped out, but they have trouble accessing climate funding because they're still seen as a conflict-prone area. This has actually been noticed with the COP28 Declaration on Climate Relief, Recovery and Peace, calling to increase support in such areas. And in practice, to implement the solution, it requires us to simplify how such fragile countries actually access this fund because it's pretty complicated and for them to access it. And we have to facilitate more easier absorption of this finance by working with the local communities or government. And after this, we also have to address the root cause of the fragility itself. This could be poverty, instability, or local conflicts. Therefore, we must realize that although these countries may be the most difficult to invest in, they're also the areas that it's most important to invest in because they contain the most vulnerable populations that are impacted by climate change. So, to conclude, if you do want to insulate green transactions from geopolitical shocks, the framework should focus on diversifying your supply chains away from certain monopolies, building regional trade routes that can be resilient and bypass conflict prone areas, and provide climate finance for conflict prone and vulnerable areas instead of abandoning or ignoring them.
Thank you, Varsha, for like these deeply insightful and reflective of the real-time issues that solutions that you put forward. Uh, what emerges from this is we see that our solutions are whatever we are whatever multilateral governance we're looking for, or what countries will look for from a standpoint is more of away from the conflict zone, right? Because obviously we want to avoid it so it doesn't affect our economies, or it doesn't affect our political stance, or if it doesn't affect our stance as a nation, right? So moving on from that, we directly transition into what is the unsettling truth that even as we draft our treaties and diversify supply chains, much of our climate ambition remains disturbingly fragile in the face of militarized interests and geopolitical activity. Right. Um, yeah. So we will now move on to like the second question, um, which is how do conflict-driven shifts in global finance and trade prioritize affect priorities affect climate financing for the global south? And I would like Siddharth to take up this question and answer it.
Okay, so let's take a scenic route through how our obsession with conflict is strangling climate finance, especially for the global south. And this is going to feature a wonderful relationship between the donor nations to the official development assistance, or the ODA, and their ever expanding defense budgets. So the ODA is a pool of funds that's meant to help developing nations build climate resilience. So stuff like solar grids, early warning systems, and all that. But when conflicts do show up, a prime example of these funds getting diverted in the modern, in a very uh, contemporary setting would be Ukraine and Sahel in Africa. Climate goals vanish faster than my will to live during a Monday 9 a.m. But yeah, the case in point in 2022, Kenya had to reroute its ODA toward famine relief because, yeah, when people are starving, resilient infrastructure feels like a luxury, and it is a luxury at that point. While NATO's budget, defense budget specifically, soared by about 13%, and that is just showing that tanks apparently have better PR than turbines, and only about 3% of the ODA was sent to crisis-struck countries, went into climate adaptation, which is laughably low. Like, I could get better returns on post office FDs. Over 100 billion was pledged to the Climate Finance Fund in 2009. The developed countries have finally met this in 2022, but unfortunately, most of it was just old money packaged into a new envelope. And this is what the ODA is. And this is probably the only thing they're capable of recycling. The Green Climate Fund, which was mentioned by some of my uh, peers, was a great idea, but unfortunately, the follow through was abysmal. In 2022, only about 12% of the multilateral uh, climate funds actually reached the states it was intended to reach. Why? Because conflict zones are going to suck up the attention and money like a vacuum. In the Horn of Africa, drought response devoured the funds that was meant for prevention. So why build a dam when you can just heroically show up to the scene when the dam bursts? But there's also something else, the global shield against climate risks, which is climate finance's supposed knight in shining armor rolled out in COP27, promised a swift insurance-based relief, but in war-torn fragile states, it's about as reliable as Jindal Wi-Fi. And Pakistan in 2022, they had massive floods that caused about 30 billion dollars in damages in a country responsible for about actually no, less than 1% of global emissions. The insurance support was non-existent. Their premiums are insanely high. The risks are not insurable. The payouts feel symbolic instead of actually going to contribute to something. And the humanitarian aid fills the void. But again, let's be honest, it's a taping over tracks as big as the Grand Canyon. And yes, the loss and damage fund, which was also unveiled in the COP27, was supposed to be the global south's big break in climate justice, but it's just long-winded and superficial policies more than anything else. The transitional committee still can't decide who is actually going to pay the bill. The US and the EU push for the World Bank to host it, the same institution that gives out more loans than resolutions. Meanwhile, innovative ideas like taxing big oils, debt swaps, even like putting some curbs on fossil fuel profits do float around. They get mentioned. Every conference and big committee talks about them, but no one's going to actually decide to use them. The global south contributes peanuts to emissions. Like I mentioned, Pakistan does less than 1%, and the G20 takes up about 80% of the emissions. But they are also made to bear the hardest consequences, and conflicts only make it worse as they amplify resource crises, they amplify displacement and violence. What could help? I mean, climate finance, yeah. But what actually is happening is a tug of war between tanks and tokenism. What we need are moves that aren't just band aids. So things like aviation levies, fossil fuel taxes, debt relief tied to green goals. But right now, the global focus is more on firefighting, both metaphorically and literally, than future proofing.
Thank you, Siddharth, for that wonderfully descriptive um, answer. I I'm at a loss of words, but what I can pick up from what you said was how treaties or funds or finance that we do put towards the climate is either met too late or is not met at all, or these are just performative and too, it's tokenism, right? It's like saying, oh, I did something, like how the right now the Indian government is cutting down 130 acres of land in the trees in the Andaman Nicobar and saying, "Oh, I planted trees in Madhya Pradesh." So it's performative. It's not making any solutions, and it shows that we're lacking as on the global level that we're lacking, right? In terms of climate change, in terms of any climate funding that actually takes effect. And even if they do, they're too late into the future, right? And this we can delve directly into the next question, which is can international law on sorry, can international law or multilateral government frameworks meaningfully prevent environmental damage during wartime? Akshita, you can take up this question.
Thank you, Navya. I would like to start. Sorry, one second. I would like to start off by talking about a notable war which had severe environmental damage, Vietnam War, which ran for 20 long years, from 1955 to 1975. It was a war between South Vietnam and North Vietnam. The USA in that war sprayed 20 million gallons of toxic herbicides, which are known as Agent Orange, which basically destroyed a lot of forests and crops. 4.5 million acres of jungle and farmlands were destroyed. But not only that, it this basically this poison caused cancers, birth defects, and soil toxicity. But USA was still not penalized by any international law. Now is that right? And it also derives the question: are international laws enough to prevent environmental damage during wartime? And now I would like to talk about some of those international laws. And I would like to start off by talking about Geneva Conventions. So in 1977, additional protocol were added to Geneva Convention, and basically these included two critical articles. First was Article 35, Part 3. It basically prohibits methods or any means of warfare intended or expected to cause, now these three are keywords: widespread, long-term, or severe damage to natural environment. And there is one more article, the second article, which is basically Article 55. And it's kind of a guiding article. It requires states to protect the environment against any damage that might harm civilian population through environment destructions. Now, as we know, the USA was not penalized in that Vietnam War. So there is clearly a loophole, like clearly shortcomings in these. Now we'll explore what are those. Basically, international law has the high threshold for violations. Now the three keywords I spoke: widespread, long-term, and severe, they are extremely difficult to meet, like in Vietnam War. And the other example can be Kuwait oil fires. Basically, Saddam Hussein's forces set fire to 600 oil wells, and it caused a lot of air pollution. Now, while Iraq was fined for it, there were no war crime prosecution occurred under the Geneva Conventions. But now that might not have been the case if war crimes were committed against humans. So why is it environment damage taken so lightly? And and sorry, there is war crimes against humans. There is no such enforcement court or tribunal for penalizing wars again. For penalizing environmental damage occurred in war times. And the second international law, which basically talks about environmental damage during wartime, is International Law Commission Draft Principles. And ILC basically proposed 27 principles which strengthen environmental protection in conflict. And some of those are Principle 10. It basically bans any attacks against the environment. Then Principle 13. So it says whenever a conflict has happened, you have to assess the damage occurred to the environment after that conflict. Like suppose measuring pollution from bomb factories. Now it's one of the most common ways in which environmental damage happens. Other countries might bomb the factories which release toxins into the environment. And the next principle would be Principle 16. It basically urges domestic states to criminalize wartime eco-destruction and code them, basically make them laws, domestic laws. But it also has its own limitations. These principles are not binding in nature, they're non-binding, almost like guiding. Now, a country could ignore these principles and not have any consequences. And as I already mentioned before, there is no enforcement body to enforce such principles. And I would also like to talk about the emerging trend in which basically when ceasefire happens, countries put a climate clause into the ceasefire agreements. Like, let's take an example: Colombia's 2016 peace deal. It included provisions. So what it basically did was, there were provisions that they demilitarize power zones, so that there is no harm happening to those, to preserve the environment. And they would also not conduct any like pipeline attacks. But then there is also a limitation to this, that these are voluntary in nature. Like, the countries choose to enter into this. There is no mandate that they have to. So while international laws do have the provision to prevent like environment damage and to address it, it's not enough. Like, it needs to be strengthened, made mandatory. And so what is missing now in international laws? And specifically, as I've already talked about it, there is need for like an enforcement body, a specialized tribunal to address these environment war crimes, as there are for to address like war crimes against humans. And then we need to lower those thresholds, like those keywords: widespread, swear, and long. These are very wide in nature, like, and very hard to meet. And then also like post-war environmental assessments, like the principle 13 talked about, they need to be made mandatory. And yeah, that, I would like to conclude it by saying.
Thank you, Akshita, for a very informative, insight on what's happening. Like you said, there's no accountability from this so-called, first world nations. Um, and for the damage and harm they cause during wars, conflicts, and whatever their political leaders are doing in today's time. There's no regulation set in stone for them to take up responsibility, no reports, no surveys, etc. Laws and regulations that do exist are non-binding and always overlooked. Um, and we can conclude from this that wars worsen the already accelerating situation of the climate change we live in. Right. We've seen how easily sustainability goals are deprioritized when faced with urgency of war, how quickly green finance is reclassified, how supply chains become pawns, and how environmental protections are treated as uh, optional rather than integral. And yet, within that fragility lies this possibility of a reimagined global order. It's a far-fetched idea, it's too far from the truth, but it's there. There's a possibility. One where resilience is not reactive, but designed into the architecture of international cooperation. Perhaps the most important question we're left with is not what mechanisms exist, but who they are built to serve. Is it us, the people, or those billionaires, or the people who are crying for war, right? And what they choose to silence. As we move into the final segment of this roundtable, let's carry with us a reminder that conflict is never just a deviation from the sustainable path. It is a deliberate rerouting of whose futures are allowed to thrive. So, with this, I'd like to end this